Hi, I'm Marco and welcome to Swift Almanac. Welcome to our first end-to-end development effort that will result in an app that you can use to interact with the channel as well as learn vital skills that are needed to be a successful Swift developer. So to get a bit of a feel for the series, I'm hoping to complete the app before the new year, but I'm going to be loading up on the App Store along the way various versions so that you can see how to post to the App Store and update apps through the version lifecycle. This will also give you the opportunity to test things and generally get you all involved. This series is not so much as a tutorial, but rather it's a reality series. I have used Firebase, but not Firestore, and I've never used the GitHub API, so there's going to be a bit of a learning curve. I'm also doing this as a rapid development exercise, so there is no agile sprint or test coding. It's just going to be brutal coding along the way, and hopefully you get a feel for the process as well as learn some programming that you may not have seen before. You can fire off any comments or suggestions along the way. The source code will only be available on GitHub in the app only section, so you'll need to install the app and sign in to access the source code. No charge until we get to the payment gateway stage late in the cycle. The first stage is a login screen that authenticates with GitHub through Firebase. So if you don't already have a GitHub account, they are free, so sign up so you can play along. Let's get started. Okay, so the joys of producing a YouTube channel, my first effort, and there was some problem saving the screen, so I just had dialogue for the first 20 minutes, not very good. So we'll start again, and hopefully this time it'll work. It should be a lot smoother because we had some other difficulties last time involving some research, but here we go. So we need a new project, of course, because we're starting from the very beginning. And we'll call it members. We don't need core data. I'm not using unit testing. We'll save it to the desktop. Also, it's summer here in Australia, and therefore it gets very warm in my little second bedroom studio. If I'm sweating profusely, you understand why. So let's do some nice things and create a couple of groups. So we'll create a group for view controllers, and we'll move that view controller into there. We'll rename that our login view controller because that's what we're going to be doing today. Go to app delegate. We'll get rid of storyboards because we're not going to be using them. Info plist up there. We'll move assets to a group we'll call modals. And we'll create another group which we will call extensions. I think I haven't spelled it correctly. Okay, so we need just a dummy view file that we'll call default. And in our setup, we will get rid of our main interface. We're not going to have landscape left and right. It's simply going to be a portrait application. And our launch screen is going to be this default.zib. We'll set a deployment target of 11, and we are using Xcode 9.1 and you'll see down here that I have Xcode 9.1 and I also have the latest beta. But when you're developing an application, you want to use the real latest production version of the compiler Xcode or the IDE, and you don't want to change that for the period of your development cycle, because that'll cause you some grief. Unless, of course, there's a bug in the current version and you want to resolve that bug by upgrading your compiler version or IDE. But that makes if you're working in a team, means that everyone's going to be using the same version of the compiler, etc. It just makes sense. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we need to display a window, seeing as we've got rid of the storyboards. So window is going to be equal to UI window with a frame equal to UI screen.main.bounds, then window dot make key invisible, and then window dot root view controller is equal to login view controller. So when our application starts, it's going to instantiate login view controller and send us there. In our view do load, let's set the background color equal to dark green, and then we need to set up views, which is we need a button, and we need to set up the constraints. We're not going to worry about memory wardings. Function set up views, function set up constraints. Okay, so basically we want to stick a button in the middle of this window. So at the top, let git login button equals UI button. We'll give it a frame. The frame can be anything, because our constraints are going to reshape it all. So then when we're setting up our views down here, our git login button, what are we going to need? We're going to need an image for it. Set image, UI image, named, we'll call it git login button for .normal, and we're going to need a target. When we click on the button, what are we going to do? We're going to add a target. What's the difference between setting something and adding something? Isn't that a bit pedantic? Anyway, our selector. So we're going to call this selector click git login for touch up inside. So we're going to need another function which can be viewed in Objective-C called click git login, and then we're going to need to add a subview. So that should draw it. So we need this Git login button. So in my assets, I've got it from a previous project. So I'll just put that in there. Now what do we call it? Git login button, which is the name of the image. So we need to name the image correctly. And if we run that, we should get a green window up in the top left-hand corner. Okay, there you go. There is our button. Now, what we will do is have a print statement saying button clicked, and we will set up our constraints. You don't need to watch me type. So essentially, we've got to create this layout constraint, center X and center Y, and then we've got our login width of 30 and our constant of 100. So it's going to place this image in the middle of the green view, and then we have to set this translate auto resizing mask into constraints to false, and we add all those constraints to the view for our login view controller, and it's going to move it to here. Quickly run that to make sure that's the case. Okay, when we click on it, we get button clicked. When we click outside, nothing happens. So it's a little bit, I'm going to put it up a little bit higher. If you're not aware, 0, 0 is up here. So this number is a positive number. I need to take away maybe 100 from the Y coordinate. Let's try that. Run it quickly. Okay, all good. So the next thing we need to do is we're going to need to install some pod files because we're going to access Firebase, and we're also going to use a framework called AlamoFire, which allows us to make calls to web services, which we'll need as part of our GitHub thing. Creating a pod file, we will go into terminal. And we type pod init. We will see that we have a pod file. We will edit the pod file. We'll add pod AlamoFire, pod Firebase core, and pod Firebase auth. Then we'll type pod install. That all looks good. It says please close any current Xcode sessions and use the members.xc workspace for the project from now on. So we'll do that. So you can see in members, we've got a workspace file that's been created. So we just double click on that, set the project file, and you can see we've got these pods down here, a couple of frameworks. Pod files have been installed, so everyone's happy with that. We can close out a terminal. And so we need to install Firebase. So let's go into our Firebase console. I've already created a project. Just click on Add Project. You name the project, put in your region, etc. Let's go through the process. I am in Australia. Okay, so we've got our project. If we go to authentication, we're going to use the sign-up method for GitHub, which you want to enable. And you can see here it's asking for a client ID and a client secret. And it's also mentioning to complete setup, add this authorization callback URL to your GitHub app configuration. You will ignore that because we are using an iPhone, and that is not going to be our authorization callback URL. But for the time being, we'll copy it. So we're going to Swift Almanac, and I've gone, this is an organization, so we've got an OAuth app. We need to create a new one, and the application name is Swift Almanac Members. We've got a homepage at swiftalmanac.com. Your nifty Swift Almanac application, and we're going to punch in that callback URL. Just because we can't do anything without it, we're not going to use it. So we register this application, and it's going to give us a client ID and a client secret. You won't be able to see those because I'm going to block them off because we're going to be using them. And then in our here we punch in our client ID and we punch in our client secret. Now in our main, and we can save that. Now back in our application, I'm going to create another file, which is just going to be a Swift file. I'm going to call it constants. And it's going to be in models. Okay, and so what I do here is I have all of my constants for git login. So let k get client, what was the first one called? Client ID, string equals that, and let k get client secret string equals that. I'll copy those now. Okay, so I can use those globals, they're constants anywhere, and we'll be using them later. And when you download the project, those values won't be there, and you won't be able. You'll need to use your own values if you want to use this. So we don't need a logo. Everything else looks pretty good, but we still have this authorization callback URL. Hang on. Save that. We still have this the old authorization callback URL, and what we're going to actually have is something that says, I'm going to change it to Swift Almanac, and we're going to say git login is our callback URL. So I'm going to update that application. Looking good. And for the time being, we don't need that. So if we go to our documentation, getting started for iOS, and we look at authentication, GitHub. Before we begin, add Firebase Auth, we've done that. Register your app as a developed application on GitHub and get your OAuth 2 client ID and secret, we've done that. In the Firebase Console, open the Auth section. On the sign-in method, enable GitHub, which we've done, and specify the OAuth 2 client ID and client secret, which we have done. Then make sure your Firebase OAuth redirector URI is set as your authorization callback in your app setting page on the GitHub apps config. That is incorrect, and we've put our own thing in. Then it says integrate GitHub authentication into your app by following the developer's documentation. So we will open that in a new tab. And then it says use the web application flow and set up a custom URL scheme in your app to handle the OAuth 2 callback from GitHub. At the end of the GitHub sign-in flow, you will receive an OAuth 2 access token. So the key thing is here, use the web application flow and set up a custom URL scheme in your app to handle the OAuth 2 callback from GitHub. So heading back to our app, and in members at the very top, under info, we have these URL types. And we want to add a new one, and the identifier has to be our bundle identifier, which we get here in general. So it's just com/swiftalmanac.members. So that's our bundle identifier, and then the URL scheme is, well, we just called it Swift Almanac. We need to spell Almanac correctly. So we called it Swift Almanac. So when we're back here, this is the service that we'll be looking for. And so what goes, just so I understand what's going on here, these URL types, these URL schemes are registered when the app starts with the operating system. And then when there's a callback to the phone, it will go through all the registered URL schemes, and it will try and find one called Swift Almanac, and then it will send that message, or that, well, it's a message, a URL message to this application. And then it's going to be sent to our app delegate, where we do not currently have a open URL function. Oh, func application. It'll be in here somewhere. There it is. Okay. So, the application, sorry, the phone receives this URL request, and it will send it. It'll say Swift Almanac. Well, that's this application. So send that URL here to the app delegate, and this is the method that will be called. So then what we want to do is we want to check what the value of the URL scheme is. Our URL scheme is Swift Almanac, so many windows. If URL.scheme equals Swift Almanac, well, we're going to be in here. Now, our app can register as many URL schemes as it wants, so we need to be able to define which one is I'm going to be processing. Later in the app, we'll be using Stripe, which is a payment gateway, and it will register some Stripe URL schemes, and we'll need to process those. So basically, we'll have a whole series of if statements here, or switch statements, or whatever you want to, however you want to do it, to identify what all of the schemes are. And then, well, that's all we really need to worry about at the time being. Okay, so if we look at this setting up and registering, about registering, what we want to look at, right, it's the top option. So it said follow the web application flow, and so what we're going to do is we're going to send clients to this URL, and we're going to pass these 5 parameters along with this URL. Now, within our application, down here when we click, we need to basically create a URL equal to that, and then we need to add the 5 parameters. Okay, and then so what we're going to do is we're going to take this URL and pass it to a browser. So we go UI application .shared.open, create a URL and pass our URL. So that's a string, and force it. We can force it because we know it's definitely got a value, and then just for the sake of it, we will print it out so we can see what's going on. So when we run this, now when we click on the button, it should send us to GitHub and ask us for our user ID and password. Okay, we click, and there you go. Here's our URL. It's all been created correctly. We've been sent to GitHub. And it's returned us, I've already logged in, so we don't need to enter user IDs and passwords. And it's returned us to our redirect URI, which means we've come to this location here. Let's go print returned from GitHub. So according to the documentation, when we return, we will get a code and a state as some parameters. So this state is supposed to be the state that we passed. So we have to check that, make sure that that's the case, which I'm not going to do here. But if the states don't match, then it was created by a third party and the process should be aborted. And then we exchange the code for an access token by sending the code to this URL. So the first thing we need to do is get the code and the state, and those are parameters. What we should do is just check that the URL.host is equal to what we call it, get login, I think. So that is the second half of the URL that we passed. Yes, git login. So, oh, that's going to be the wrong thing. Swift Almanac. And git login, go to app delegate. And then we want to let code equals the URL. And now I've created this extension value of where you pass the parameter name and it returns the value. So URL dot value of the string that we first want is code, and then let state equals URL dot value of state. So we'll print out code and we'll print out state. Code is just going to be some random number, and state should be unguessable. Okay, so this is what it will look like. Swift Almanac app members by Swift Almanac wants to access the Mark Hoth account, personal user data, organization access to Swift Almanac, authorize Swift Almanac. We go yes. I'll need to put in my password. And it brings us back to GitHub, and then as you can see, it says returned from GitHub our print statement, but it hasn't run this this URL host thing. So let us figure out why. And the reason why it's not working is because here I've got lowercase. So we can fix that pretty straightforwardly. Okay, so we've got our code and our state, and now what AlamoFire allows us to do is to send a request to a web service without having to use a browser. So we have a list of parameters that will be in a dictionary, and I'll worry about those later. And then we go AlamoFire, but first let's do a couple of importings. AlamoFire, and we're also going to have to import Firebase, and we'll probably have to do something like Firebase app dot configure to get things going up there. AlamoFire dot request. Then we have the URL, and our URL is here. Put that in quotes. The method is .post. The parameters are going to be these parameters here. The encoding is JSON encoding .default, and the headers are nil. And so we send that request, and basically it is sent asynchronously in this enclosure. It comes back with, passes this response. So for our parameters, again, you don't want to watch me type, but we need to send a client ID, a client secret, the code, another redirect URI, and the state. So we send client ID, the client secret, which are our globals, our redirect URI. Let's change it to what it is in this app. Get login, the code that we got and the state that we got, we pass those. So everything gets passed, and then we get this response. And essentially, this response is going to have an access token and this token type. And it's also going to have the scope that we requested, which should say user. So if our response.result is successful, then we want to get the parameters that have been sent back to us. So we create a params dictionary, which is a key value pair, and then we've got this little nifty piece of code which goes through the, oh, hang on a minute. We will need to send this off and go response string. So this creates the request, and then this response string is sending it off. No need for those because we've got the enclosure. Okay, so we've got the syntax right there, although it still doesn't like it for some reason. Extra argument method in call always gives me that. In any event, once we get the response, we're going to check that we're successful. Once we're successful, we're going to create these parameters. And then for each item in our response value components, we're looking for things separated by ampersand, and then the key, which is the first item in the array, basically is separated by equals. Everything to the left is going to be the key, and everything to the right is going to be the value, and then we put them into this params key value to create our dictionary. Then what we need to do is go through our dictionary. So we get our access token, our scope, and our token type, and we can print out those out. Print access token. I'll just do that for the time being. Oh, and we've got an error. Could not find a Google service info plist. I skipped a step. Okay, let's quickly go back to project settings. Add Firebase to your app. So our bundle ID is Swift Almanac members. Don't worry about that. Register the app. Download the config file. And you can see here it's got this space bracket 4.plist. We need to rename that. Anyway, we did the pod install stuff and we added the initialization code, so we're fine for all of that. Add the plist file and get rid of all of that. Now we will run it and see if it works. Okay, so we're going through. We've got our Git login as our host. We've got our code that's come through. And then finally, we've got our access token. So the access token is what we can continuously use to access GitHub. So that's something we need to save. And what we need to do for Firebase, go back to the authentication documentation. So after we successfully sign in with GitHub, which is what we've just done, in our implementation of did complete with result error, etc., exchange the OAuth2 access token from GitHub for a Firebase credential, and it says, give us this piece of code, let credential equals GitHub auth provider.credential with access token, so we're all happy with that. And then we need to authenticate with Firebase. So we get this credential back, and that's a credential that says, hey, we're logged into Firebase, so we can authenticate here. It says the user is signed in. So let's check it out and see if it works. Signed into Firebase. Run that. Always got to be careful when you're copying and pasting code. You don't pick up an extra brace along the way. And there you go. We got our access token, and then we got our credential. We didn't bother printing it out. But when we passed our credential to Firebase, it came back and it said, we are signed in to Firebase. So that's it for logging in. In the next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to access the user information in GitHub, and we're going to create a user profile and save that to Firebase. So we've got the information in both locations. If we were to go back to our members and look at users, there it is. I've been successfully created as a user in Firebase using GitHub authentication. That happened today. Last sign in was today, and I get this exciting user UID, which is my unique identifier to Firebase for this project. And that's it for the login screen. If you've got any questions about this lesson, leave a comment below. Hit like if you learned something or enjoyed the lesson, and if you want to know more, then subscribe to the channel. It's free. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.